So it's said that the issue of Brexit will dominate Irish politics in the weeks and months ahead, and that may be the case. Solidarity and the Socialist Party intend to give the issue the time and attention it deserves. However, this being the first week of the new Dáil term, I want to make this point. We will not allow the government to use Brexit to push issues such as housing and the nurses to the back of the queue. There is a housing crisis in this country. There is a nurses' pay strike on the way. These issues cannot wait, and any attempt by the government to push these issues to the back of the queue will be resisted from these benches. We note the fact that the Taoiseach attempted to use the Brexit crisis to make a case against the nurses yesterday in the Dáil. We also note the fact that the alliance between the Fine Gael-led government and the Fianna Fáil party has not just been extended but has been strengthened. But the two parties should not presume to think that something that approximates to a national unity government can succeed in putting the fight for workers' rights onto the back burner for the duration of an emergency. If the nurses are forced to strike for pay justice, they will have our full support and the full support of a majority of the population, Brexit crisis or no. We are interested in discussing the government's preparedness for Brexit, but we also want to make some points about the preparedness of the Labour movement for Brexit. History shows that Ireland's capitalist establishment, indeed the capitalist establishment of all nations, will always and everywhere use a national emergency to their own advantage and against the interests of working people. We saw that in this country during the emergency of 1939 to 45, when wages were frozen for a full 5 years and strikes were banned for the same length of time. These measures, by the way, were introduced by the supposedly great Sean Lemass, who was never a friend of the working class. Now, I'm not in any sense comparing the seriousness of the emergency of the war years to the Brexit situation, but a crisis is a crisis, and the capitalist establishment a leopard which hasn't changed its spots. Just before Christmas, we heard this from Mr Brendan McGuinty, formerly of IBEC. He said, "For those sectors most at risk, the imposition of pay freezes as an emergency measure may have to be considered or allowed for." On top of this, we've heard talk of mass redundancies, price increases and increases in the cost of rent. For all of these reasons and more, we repeat our call on the Irish Congress of Trade Unions to convene an emergency conference of workers' representatives on the island of Ireland, from workplaces, from unions, from communities, to urgently prepare to defend the interests of working people in the crisis ahead. And we issue our call as well on individual unions to take the lead if Congress does not act or act in time. Now, on the issue of government preparedness, there's one particular issue we want to highlight tonight. That is the question of the position that Aer Lingus might find itself in the situation of a no-deal Brexit. The government's document preparing for the withdrawal of the UK from the EU states on page 39 the following, quote, "Regarding the requirement in EU law that air carriers must be majority owned and controlled by EU legal or natural persons, the Commission has underlined that it is essential for companies that wish to be recognised as EU air carriers to take all the necessary measures to ensure that they meet this requirement for March the 29th, 2019. Can the Minister inform the House as to what measures Aer Lingus are taking to meet this requirement? Aer Lingus would have had no difficulty, of course, meeting this requirement before 2006. At that point, it was majority owned and controlled by the Irish state. No problem there. However, privatisation was introduced by Fianna Fáil and supported by Fine Gael in 2006. By 2015, the process was complete. Aer Lingus was now no longer majority owned and controlled by the people of Ireland. It was now majority owned and controlled by a capitalist concern, the International Aviation Group, with a headquarters in London. What does this mean for Aer Lingus if the UK crashes out? What steps are Aer Lingus taking to deal with this problem? We're not being told. Commercial sensitivity is being used as the reason for that. Now, the people of Ireland do not own Aer Lingus any longer, but we continue to rely on it greatly, and we deserve to have these questions answered. Rather than allow any doubts to remain over the position of Aer Lingus, we propose that government should take the airline back into 100% public ownership, paying compensation only on the basis of proven need. We'll be asking some questions about this later on, and also some questions re the position of Ryanair in the event of a crash-out Brexit. Now, I'd like to make a brief point about the political crisis in the UK. Theresa May's government may have survived the motion of no confidence, but I suspect that they have now lost the confidence of their people. With 14 million people living below the poverty line and May's failure to win support for her neoliberal Brexit, the time has come for her to go. The time has come for general election. We support those in the working class movement in Britain who are calling for a general election. We want to see the Tories out, we want to see a Corbyn government, and we want to see socialist policies. That would mean a very different type of Brexit than Theresa May's bargain basement Brexit, based on privatisation and a race to the bottom for working people. Instead, one based on rejection of the EU's neoliberal rules, a defence of workers' rights and human rights, and a step towards a socialist Europe. We will judge each piece of Brexit legislation on the basis of whether it improves the interests of working class people, harms the interests of working class people, or is neutral in that respect. We will look at each piece of legislation on a case-by-case basis. Our principles and viewpoints have been set out, broadly speaking, in this speech. That is our position.